Welcome to another episode of POLITalks at TAMUSA, the podcast of the political science program here at Texas A&M University in San Antonio. I am honored and thrilled to have as guest today Dr. Mark Rozell, who is the founding dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government, the Ruth D and John T. Hazel Faculty Chair in Public Policy at George Mason University, and one of the foremost scholars in the field of American government, and especially in topics regarding the presidency in the United States, I could say, and also someone who I'm delighted to see again in person. It's been a while. Welcome, Dr. Rozell.
Thank you. Delighted to be here and really good to reconnect with you.
Absolutely. So we can jump right in. This podcast is meant to talk about politics and political science and the academia, but also to give us a sense to our students and to everyone who's listening of what it means to choose a life in political science or a life in the academia. So usually I'm always interested in sharing that with our listeners and viewers, namely the conversation partners' background and sort of origins. How did you stumble onto political science? So let's start with that. Where were you born and where did you grow up?
Yeah, I grew up in northern New Jersey, born in Patterson, raised in Ridgewood. My family moved to Orange County, New York in my teen years, so I spent my high school years there. And I developed my interest in politics, government studies very early. I was not the greatest at the math and science subjects, but I really loved history, philosophy, American politics. I was following political campaigns from a very young age. I was very intrigued by it. And I started doing a lot of reading in middle school, high school, U.S. history, American presidents, campaigns and elections. So it became a passion of mine. And even as a teenager, I did multiple internships with my local member of Congress, Ben Gilman, in New York State at that time, a moderate Republican. I didn't really care about partisanship at that time so much as I just wanted to get involved in the game and learn about it. And I was really drawn to it from a very young age.
Yes, indeed at a young age. Did you have a mentor figure, like a teacher who taught a good history class that got you into it, or it was just organic?
Yeah, it wasn't entirely organic. I think it was within me, right, that I had this interest in what's going on in the political world. So I was a very avid reader of the news from a very young age and loved reading history books about the American system and American presidents and the like. But I had some very good teachers in my high school who motivated me a great deal. And actually, I wasn't sure even when I first went to college if I would follow the academic path necessarily. I could tell you my senior year in college, I took both the GRE and the LSAT, thought about law school, the possibility. And after taking the LSAT, I just had this feeling like I don't have a passion for this. And I will say at my small liberal arts college in upstate New York, Eisenhower College, which got absorbed at that time into the Rochester Institute of Technology as its liberal arts campus, I had absolutely wonderful political science mentors. And all the credit at that critical period of my academic development that I ended up taking the path that I've never regretted doing what I've done in my career.
Yeah, that's actually would have been my next question. Did you ponder whether or not to go into the practical side of politics or to go into the academia? But you just addressed that. Did you discover that you want to be in the academia because of the life of the mind and reading and writing, or just through your internships you said, well, this is fun, but perhaps too much fun for me?
It's a combination, and it's the right question, and it's a lesson I tell my students all the time. Do that internship. So George Mason University is located in the Washington, D.C. community, and for the Schar School of Policy and Government, we have campuses both in Fairfax and Arlington, right on the edge of Washington. So it's a great advantage for my students to get involved in internships in the Washington community. And I tell them it was through internships that in some respects I found out what I didn't want to do. I did several internships on Capitol Hill, both senior year in high school and also as an undergraduate student. And I loved learning about politics and government and its operations, but seeing it on the ground and what people had to do in order to be effective practitioners did not appeal to me so much. And quite frankly, I'm not a partisan. Um, I want to follow the evidence wherever it leads and come to the conclusion based on the best evidence and analysis. And to be a practitioner, you got to pick a side usually, and you know, and, and you have to have a passion for that, and that's just not me. So it became clear to me that the academic path really made a lot of sense. And I just love the study of politics and political science with my undergraduate professors at Eisenhower College. And when I looked to them, I thought that should be me one day, what they do. Imagine that you get paid for the life of the mind to read all the great books and have students and, and be able to have so much control over what you do on a day-to-day basis in terms of your research, and you get to follow your passion. So I didn't think I'd make a lot of money at it, but I thought I would have a really good life doing it, and I've never regretted it.
Exactly, and that's exactly the reason why I always delve in this subject with my conversation partners, because this is for a regular student, the idea of being in the academia, this sort of a profession is sort of esoteric, like what does a professor do, what does it mean to live this sort of a life, and you need to see it, you need to have role models, you need to see and to see how it's lived to the fullest in order to be attracted to it, and then perhaps you also need to do some teaching assistantships and so on. So when you went on to graduate school, did you also get a chance to teach, and did you fall in love with that as well?
Yeah, so I did my graduate studies, both my master's degree and my PhD at the University of Virginia. Um, Now called the Department of Politics. Back then it was the Department of Government and Foreign Affairs. And it was a great choice for me. Some very distinguished political scientists there. We're not strong in the behavioral science side of the field, and that was very purposeful on my part to go in in the tradition of the more uh, non-behavioral, historical, philosophical, grounded study of politics. And I can tell you a quick story, by the way. My undergraduate mentor, I had three fantastic political science professors at Eisenhower College: Albert Osman, um, James Troisi, and James Fleming. And Jim Fleming was my principal mentor. I took 6 courses with him. His mentor was Charles O. Jones, very famous political scientist. And that had a big influence on my decision to go to UVA, where he was a Hawkins professor of political science. And he turned out to be a great mentor. I turned out being the first second generation PhD of Chuck Jones. In other words, a PhD of one of his former PhD mentees. So we always had some great stories about that connection. So, but there, Henry Abraham was on the faculty, David O'Brien, James Caesar, James Sterling Young, as well as Stephen Finkel, who would, I did teaching assistantship with him and also with Jim Young and with Charles O. Jones. And I had the opportunity to teach. I even taught my own summer class while a PhD student. And so they gave me many opportunities to be in the classroom in order to develop, my skills as a teacher. And as I got more and more into it, I was really sure that this is exactly the right choice. And by the way, I started in the public administration program and got a master's degree in public administration. You'll see how old I am now. This was the early 80s. There was a big recession. And people in higher education were telling me, even some of my mentors undergraduate school, get the PhD for its own sake if you think it's worth doing it for that reason alone, but don't expect a job. So the conventional wisdom of that time was that it was a really difficult career to get into. Well, the fact that I still went really told you a lot about I was going to follow my passion and I was going to do this, despite the advice that maybe I pick a profession where the job opportunities are going to be much greater. So the MPA degree, I think, was a sensible choice because I thought, well, government service would certainly be a noble profession too if things don't work out in the teaching field. But it ended up being one of my primary subfields towards my PhD program. So that ended up working out very well for me eventually. And in the mid 80s, when I was out on the job market, there were jobs, things that
Turned around.
turned around. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So, do you tell your students follow your passion? Sometimes it's maybe not exactly the right advice, but I did, and it worked out for me. Um, I'm one of the lucky ones, I guess.
Yes, but it's always, and especially with political science, this is one of those fields that you need to discover, to be put into the situation of facing it in order to discover whether or not you like it or love it, right? Because it's one of those fields, unlike engineering or medicine or legal, the legal field, that you don't know what it means, right? Everybody thinks, oh, political science probably it's about Trump and Kamala Harris or something, and it's much more interesting than that. I always say, but for that you need to take at least one class, and I always experience this that. When you teach intro classes to political science where you recruit students to the field, there's always a portion of your students that will fall in love with the discipline because naturally they are inclined to this. But you need to get the opportunity to discover this field because otherwise it remains I don't even know what you do there as a political scientist. So this is why it's so important to take good classes, to have good mentors, and to have the choice of discovering these fields. And as you said, of discovering what you don't like.
Yes. Yeah, and that's very important. And that's what I tell my students all the time. And that's okay. It's a great thing. Even students going to law school who are a little bit unsure if they have a passion for the study of the law, maybe get a paralegal job first or maybe intern at a law firm. Because 3 years in law school is a huge commitment. And then you get out and you find out you don't want to do this. That would not be the best thing. So, while you're exploring your options, do an internship, volunteer, whatever, get the experience, see what it's like in that career and whether you really do have a passion for it. But on the other hand, a law degree is transferable to a lot of other things than just practicing law. So,
but I have met, as you said, I have met unhappy lawyers. So we all have we all have met that.
I'll tell you one quick story. So one of my students years ago comes to me and says, I really think I would love doing what you do, but I'm going to go to law school. And I said, well, why? He's like, my parents are telling me go to law school, you make more money. I said, well, how do you feel about that? Yeah, I'm not that excited, but everybody's telling me it's the much more practical thing to do, and I'll do better. And I looked at him and I said, okay, you'll make a lot more money in law than what I do. I grant that. Um, so there are trade-offs that you do have to take into account. Your parents are right about that. How do you feel about, I don't know, the next 40, 45 years of your adult life? You get up every day doing something you're not passionate about. What kind of cost is there in that? And it's like the light bulbs, lit up. So he ended up not going to law school and never regretted it. So
Absolutely, absolutely. That's exactly the question. That's you wake up. Are you looking forward to your day, or do you dread it? That's the question. Are you looking forward to your day, and if you dread it, then what's the point? Because you will never be successful at something that you hate. And then after you graduated, got your PhD, what was your institutional sort of pathway? Like, where did you start working? Was Catholic University the first school where you taught?
no, I spent the first 10 years of my teaching career right out of graduate school. In fact, I was still working on my dissertation when I took an assistant professor position at what was called Mary Washington College. It's now got the university title in Fredericksburg, Virginia. So I was there for 10 years, wonderful place, great students, but it was a 4-4 teaching load, not a great deal of support for research and scholarship at that time, so I ended up leaving, even though, I had tenure there and I had an easy career if I wanted to stay there. I just wanted something more. Um, and it's not that I don't like the teaching. I love the teaching side of the profession, but I wanted the balance that would give me more flexibility to do the grounded research that I really care about and be more active on the scholarly side. So For those of us who know all the academic lingo, right, 4-4 teaching load, it's a heavy teaching load. And it doesn't leave the kind of time for um, in-depth scholarship that some of us really crave if we're interested in exploring different topics and making a contribution.
Yes, and there's always a right balance, right? Because I find that I miss teaching if I only do research, but I also can't only teach because otherwise it drains up the intellectual juices drain up, and you know, you need to balance these, and as you said, the 4-4 teaching load is not conducive to that. So then you moved the next was the next institution Catholic University of America?
Well, I had a couple year period at American University in their Washington program, the Washington, they call it Washington semester. That was really a wonderful experience because I had to bring in a lot of guest speakers and arrange a lot of events, programs in the Washington community for the students. And these were students coming from all over the country into this program. And so actually I learned a lot being in that program and made a lot of connections with people at different lobby firms, interest groups, Capitol Hill, the White House. You know, it was, I actually ended up doing a book on interest groups and elections, and a big basis of the book was my own interviews with interest group and lobby firm leaders. And that all came about because of all the connections I made through that program where I taught for a few years. But out of that program, I got the offer of a, you know, tenured uh, professor position at the Catholic University of America, where we all met. And I had a wonderful 7 years there as professor of politics, and chaired the department for a couple of years before George Mason convinced me to come over where I've been now for the past 21 years.
But that, you know, that takes us to obviously your next stage. But before that, you know, this kind of you know, taps into the same thing that you mentioned, that it's important as a political scientist, and at least I see it that way, and I think that you as well, to keep a foot in the real politics, Just like students need to do internships, you also need to keep a foot in real politics in one way or another. And there's different ways of doing this, because there is the danger of the, you know, ivory tower and so on. And you know, my background too, it was, you know, I started in policy, but I keep being nourished by those experiences, and I think that's it's fundamental. And I always push my students to do internships, go study abroad, because that's what will feed your thinking about these things.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I've had a very fortunate career in that when I've wanted to make a move, I've been able to do so, but always within the Washington region, where I do want to be connected to the, you know, as you say, the real world of politics. And I think I'm a better scholar as a result of it, and a better teacher, better leader now of a policy and government school as a result of that. I think there are things I can uniquely do in the Washington community that I would not be able to do anywhere else. So it's been, I think, a great fortune for me for my own research and teaching too.
Absolutely. And I always tell my students, you want to get into politics, depends what, but go to the place where that happens. Go to the place where that happens. Do your master's, PhD somewhere in that region, because you need to tap into those things and to get the connections and so on. So as the founding dean of the Schar School, what can you tell us about this institution that you founded, right, as a dean, Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University? When you were recruited specifically for that position, right?
Well, not quite. Actually, so I was recruited in year 2004 to join what was called the School of Public Policy as professor. So the policy school back then was exclusively graduate professional education on the Arlington, Virginia campus only. So that was my academic home for several years before the unexpected thing happened that my now predecessor as dean in the summer of 2013, so 9 years after I joined Mason as a professor, he suddenly stepped down, and I was lecturing in Shanghai in summer, and I get a call from the provost, and he tells me, your dean has stepped down and your colleagues have turned to you. Would you be willing to step up as a service for 1 year while we do a search for a dean. So after some discussions, I agreed to do it. I said, I'll do it for 1 year, but I'm coming back to faculty after that. Well, the dean search failed. I said, I'll come back for 1 more year, but I'm going back to faculty. That and dean search didn't go very well. Third time I said, I'm in. I'm going to apply. And they had a competitive search. They had 6 finalists on campus. I was one of them. I did fortunately get the position. So I'm now finishing my second 5-year term after doing an additional 3 years as the interim dean. So it's been kind of a long haul, but during this process, while I was interim dean, the president of the university, Angel Cabrera, called me and said, there's been talk in the past about creating a merger of 2 large academic units, and I think it's time that we bring that discussion back. And so after some discussions, we decided we would try to bring what would usually be called the political science department. It was called the Department of Public and International Affairs on the main campus together with the public policy school. And this, I think, was kind of a daring idea because, as you know, at most big universities, the political science department is in the social sciences division or college, and the public policy professional school is completely separated from that. And they all don't get along with each other, or they don't talk to each other, right, very much. And so we did the daring of proposing a merger. We had a year-long negotiating process with a committee and faculty votes, and we finally decided to do it. So that created the new school that combined the 2 large academic units. And then we successfully brought what's called a naming gift. So a very generous philanthropist, Dwight Schar, one of the largest in America. He's always been a supporter of George Mason first, and he gave a very generous philanthropic gift. So in year 2016, we became the Schar School of Policy and Government, and I was the inaugural dean, and so they gave me the title, the founding dean.
Yes, yes. And how has the experiment worked out?
It worked out wonderfully, actually. I will tell you that, at the early stage, it wasn't easy, right? Because you have a core liberal arts unit coming together with a graduate professional unit, and they have different values about higher education, right? And it was inevitable that there would be some battling over what this new school put together was going to look like. Who was going to lead it, what the bylaws would say, how the academic programs would be constituted, and it was a lot of work. It was an enormous amount of work actually to bring it together, and it was also an enormous amount of work to build a common culture over time. And so it's really worked out wonderfully well. I can just tell you that before the merger, I'm a political scientist, right? And I was hired in the policy professional school. If I wanted to teach a political science class to the undergraduates, the answer was absolutely no, because of the way budgets are configured among the 10 schools or colleges of the university. So my unit's not going to let me teach and they get the revenue while my unit's paying my salary, right? And to me, this was just crazy. I was among several political scientists who could be really amplifying, the program in political science on the main campus and teach undergraduates, and I wanted to do that. And in their unit, they had faculty who absolutely should be doing graduate professional education, and we should all be together. We're kind of close cousins to each other in terms of our academic disciplines and backgrounds. So once we came together, we fought a good deal about the fundamentals, but once that was all done, people got to work. And now, a decade later, almost a decade later in the new school, we've risen tremendously in the rankings. People are teaching across both campuses. That gives students more opportunity as well to do education across the 2 campuses as part of their degree programs. It's just been a win-win for everybody.
And also it gives the students flexibility in the sense of which path to choose, right? Because it's exactly what we are talking about, combining the two, but keeping them in a balance. But that also doesn't just enrich the learner and the teacher, but it also gives choices to the students which path they want to take, right? Because they can dip their toes in both and then choose whichever works better or whichever pays, if it's about that.
Yeah, no, it's exactly right. I'll just give an example. So during my deanship, we started a new graduate program in international security studies, master's degree professional program in Arlington. And it has soared in the rankings and it became our major enrollment driver in our master's degree programs. It's been a huge success. Well, we ended up building on that success and creating an undergraduate degree program called International Security and Law. It's been in existence for 2 years. We already have over 100 majors in the program, and it's also on an upward trajectory. So this enabled us to innovate and create new effective programs, which is wonderful for the students, and it's really worked out well for us.
Yeah, and this takes me to that another idea that has been preoccupying me for a long, long time, that everybody talks about interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity. Very few people do it or do it well. It's usually just a buzzword, but I think that there is true and real value in creating truly interdisciplinary programs or initiatives or classes. I always teach interdisciplinary classes when I have an opportunity. If you do it right and if you respect each discipline's integrity and autonomy, then it can be very enriching, and it actually fits our way of functioning as human beings, because we don't live in niches. We understand the human existence as something more holistic, global, and this sort of feeds into that. So I think that your experiment and it working out, it sort of speaks to that.
Yes, yeah, that's exactly right. And that's who we are, precisely. We are a multidisciplinary unit, so we're a school of policy and government. And not surprisingly, about half our faculty, we have about 80 full-time faculty, are in political science, but half are not. And we have historians, sociologists, law, anthropologists. I mean, the list goes on. And we're all studying the insights of multidisciplines at the intersection of public policy issues and problems, bringing the frameworks and understandings of the different disciplines together, which I think is just wonderful for students. And I think that's the future of higher education, right?
Absolutely.
So I said before, we had some challenges in bringing together two academic units. And one of those challenges was that some people really just care about disciplinary professionalism and want to stay right within that framework alone. And they don't really have such a passion for multidisciplinary perspectives, right? And that's understandable given their professional training. They've been socialized into a particular discipline, its methodologies, its way of communicating, its lingo, all of those things, and asking people suddenly to transition from that into an entirely different framework doesn't come easily for some people.
Absolutely, absolutely. But on the other hand, getting stuck in a niche of not even a discipline, but a school of thought within the discipline, within a subfield of a subfield, as it usually happens, in such cases, that's not conducive to either the intellectual development of them as scholars or of the students as human beings. At the end of the day, we are helping grow students as human beings. That's the goal eventually, right? That's what we're aiming at, and we're doing it from a perspective, but you have to look at them as full human beings, and that's what we're trying to serve, right? And in that sense, this sort of an approach indeed is, as you said, much more productive and the future of education. And it's you can see it in the growth of interdisciplinary and honors programs across the country. They speak to this sort of an approach. But speaking of scholarship, you have done tremendous amount of work. You have published more than 14 books on your own, edited another 20 something. on topics regarding American government, and especially the presidency, the politics of the South and of Virginia, religion and politics. And some of your books have been hailed as, and I quote, right, the definitive book on the subject. So I would like to touch on some of those aspects if we can, especially since we just have a new president. And, you know, I'm nonpartisan as well. This podcast is nonpartisan. So we're, just like you do in your books, you know, we study politics and the evidence, whatever it takes us, yeah? And actually, you know, if people pick up your books, which will be linked in the description of this video or audio file, so you can find all the books by Dr. Rozell there. If they pick up your books on the presidency, for example, on the executive privilege, they will see that you look at all the presidencies, because if there's one common trait since World War II, especially in the New Deal, is that the presidency has only grown in importance, stature, and all the presidents have grabbed for more power. So let's talk a little bit about that. First of all, why you've already been fascinated by the presidency, and how did you then focus more on this sort of imbalance that has developed in the U.S. political system between the role and position of the president and the other two branches?
Yeah, so I don't think there is any more important topic in American government these days, and it's been a long-standing issue, not just in the Trump presidency, regarding separation of powers, the proper roles of the branches of our government, the institution of the presidency, as you point out, having grown so substantially in power over time, and the oftentimes even scholarly justifications for principles of executive authority, unilateral authority. I think these are very dangerous ideas for our republic. The constitutional framers, in my view, had it right about the critical importance of balancing powers among the different branches of the government. But over the years, Congress, I don't believe, has done a terribly good job of protecting its institutional powers and prerogatives when presidents have overreached in the exercise of their authority. And that's a particularly pronounced problem now. So again, it didn't start with Donald Trump. You know, the three books primarily that I've written in this area, one on the use of White House czars, a book that came out in the Obama era that was very critical of the practices of a Democratic president for using this extra constitutional mechanism to have people within an administration who had not been vetted through the normal process of approval by the Senate and have control over broad areas of policy as well as budgetary allocations, right? So it was conservatives who were sounding the alarms about this at the time. My analysis just happened to fall within the framework of their criticisms of President Obama overreaching in his exercise of executive powers, but then turned to my book on the unitary executive, the principle that some have articulated that the president, as the head of the executive branch, therefore has full control over all of its operations, and that his powers are virtually unlimited under Article 2. Well, of course, Mr. Trump said, I have an Article 2, I can do what I want, right? I'm paraphrasing just slightly there, but he has this vision of the presidency that the president has unilateral authority. He can sit at the big desk, issue executive orders, and it's like running his big corporation. And he's even expressed in his first term as president annoyance at the Madisonian concept of separation of powers and said it's not a good way to run a government. So, you know, the works that I have written more recently on the unitary executive, probably more critical of what's happened with Republican administrations. It just turned out that way because it just so happens that a Republican president now, more than any before, has been stretching the limits of unilateral executive authority. And we happen to have a Congress right now that, in my view, isn't doing its job as a counter to the unilateral exercise of executive powers. And I really worry about this because once Congress stands down and lets a president use expansive powers with no effective counterweights or controls, that's creating precedents. Now, they might like it because it's a Republican president and they like his policies, and standing down and letting him do all these things unilaterally gets them the outcomes that they want in public policy. But they're sure going to hate it when a Democrat is in the White House doing exactly the same thing because the precedent has been established. So this to me is the really big issue about our constitutional system. And it's been a problem for a long time, but it's been hugely amplified by the current administration.
Yeah, and that's, I think that's, again, one of the wonderful things about the books that you mentioned is that you go through all the presidencies, basically. You go to one presidency after the next, and, Democrats and Republicans, and to point out that the same, the claims of executive privilege or unitary executive or all of these have been used by every single president in various ways to various degrees. Of course, then there's a pushback if you go too far, and then there's a period of calm, right, with executive privilege from Nixon to Clinton. There was a lull, but then, it doesn't go away because, as the framers rightly, in the Federalist Papers indicated, the idea was that all of these institutions will have their own ambition, but the idea was for ambition to counteract ambition, for the different branches to check on each other. But as I tell my students, what if they don't? What happens if they don't? Which was the criticism, of course, of the anti-federalists, which said, well, the states don't really have a play here, don't really have a say, so what about that? So if we were to take a bigger picture, because this is one of the reasons, right, for the growth of the power of the presidency is the fact that the other branches have been reluctant to do their job, and Congress has delegated powers, has not cut short the claims of power of the president, especially if it was the same party. But why did Congress do that? What did you see in all these, as a common thread? Why would the other branches, especially Congress, be reluctant to do its job?
So a lot of it is just politics, right? That members of Congress in the Republican Party today, for example, fear being primaried. Donald Trump has never hesitated to pose a threat to an incumbent Republican in Congress that he'll help to put forward and promote the political campaign of a more quote unquote conservative Republican and unseat a member of his own party in a primary. So the members see that as a real threat. Now, I guess I'm a little idealistic here, but I just feel like saying, let them primary you. I mean, you've got a job to do in Congress. Congress needs to protect its institutional powers and prerogatives, whether it's a Democrat or Republican in the White House. You need to uphold that fundamental basis of our system of separated powers. And if the cost of doing the right thing is you get primaried, make your case, you can have a good life after Congress. You can probably even make more money and do some really interesting things. Why is being in the institution the be all and end all of your existence that you're willing to stand down in this way and let a president just run roughshod over the entire system? But that's not happening, right? Members of the Republican Party right now are standing with a president of their own party. And Democratic members of Congress have done that with a Democrat in the White House as well. So, it's not as though this is entirely in our modern history of separation of powers.
Yeah, but you did notice one of the solutions to the problem is instead of changing, going to, I don't know, constitutional amendment or something, you did point out that also in this dynamic, part of the political or really party politics dimension of politics is that parties will alternate in power. So in a way, the solution is embedded in the problem because one of your conclusions to one of the books say that, the other party will come in and they will do the checking, if not for anything but for partisan purposes.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So in my book on executive privilege, the right of the president to withhold information from those who have compulsory power, right, congressional committees and independent counsels, special counsels, and the like, the courts. Presidents sometimes will claim national security or some other compelling need to withhold information. And that's constitutionally grounded under the right circumstances, but it's not an unlimited power. And some have said, well, maybe we need a legislative solution to the problem of executive privilege because presidents are overreaching in the use of that power, and maybe a public law, that sets the parameters and defines what a president can do could solve the problem. And I said, well, actually, the system of separated powers has all the controls built into it under the Constitution. It's just a matter of Congress using the tools that it already has at its disposal. And quite frankly, throughout history, as I document in the book, there are many cases where a president overreached in the use of executive privilege and a congressional committee pushed back, and there were threats of contempt citations, for example, threats of withholding funds for presidentially favored programs, threats of bottling up the president's agenda, and usually what happened is there was a process of accommodation where both parties would get together and work out a compromise, and both would walk away claiming victory, once they figured out a path forward. But importantly to today's context, this isn't happening so well right now. There's a lot more zero-sum politics going on in these disputes between the branches, right? Not just Mr. Trump, some of his predecessors, George W. Bush, for example, in a number of cases. Take us to court. We'll fight this. So that I think has been really problematic for the system, the lack of the traditional norms of accommodation and compromise where the parties get together and work something out. Now, with regard to separation of powers and the role of the courts, for example, we have a president right now who's just saying he will defy, right, the courts. This is hugely problematic, deeply concerning, because our Constitution, as you know, is not self-executing. The federal courts have no enforcement mechanism at their disposal. They don't control, a police force or an army, to enforce their decisions. It depends on the executive branch following the norms of the system to respect the rule of law, the right of the federal courts to have the say on the meaning of the law and the Constitution, and to do the right thing and execute the law. But what happens when you have an executive who says, not going to do it, I defy? There's a big hole in our system right now.
And it doesn't help. And it doesn't help if the Attorney General says that she's there to serve the president, right, rather than the Constitution, which was a recent quote. And again, just to repeat, I am not partisan, nor is this podcast, but it's a common trait. And you're just looking at events, and this is not helpful because the whole point is that the Department of Justice enforces the law. And that's their job, and they have to be faithful to that and to the Constitution. Otherwise, the whole system, as you said, doesn't execute itself.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And it's important to emphasize we're both not coming at this from a partisan perspective. It just so happens, as we're talking right now, there's a Republican in the White House, a Republican majority in Congress. But if we were having this discussion during, let's say, the Obama era, right, I would have been telling you a lot of things that I don't like about the use of White House czars, and a president who actually said multiple times that he would look for ways to make an end run around Congress and do whatever he can using executive powers, right? So I was very critical of the president back then for how he was exercising some aspects of executive powers, and was deeply concerned about where this was all heading because it would set precedents for future presidential administrations.
And once you grab for power, it never shrinks back. It's just a continued expansion of the same practice. George W. Bush used signing statements. Obama tried to use signing statements. So there you go. It's not from one party to the other. It doesn't matter. If it's there, with all the best intentions, but that's the genius, I would say, of the framers, that they had this nice view of the correct view of human nature. Don't count on good intentions, but because that's in fact the most dangerous thing, to allow people to bypass the limits of their power because of good intentions.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the signing statements is a great example of that. When Barack Obama first ran for the presidency in 2008, he said very explicitly, even put it in writing, that he would not issue signing statements. He was citing his own background as a constitutional law professor, right? And saying that he understands how the Constitution works and separation of powers, and that it's Congress's right to write the law. The president has one option: veto the bill in its entirety or sign it. But when he became president, he discovered the utility of signing statements. And on several occasions, he used signing statements appended to legislation, which, in my opinion, are constitutionally dubious. Right?
Of course, they're a way of bypassing the limits of the role of the president in the legislative process. And normally, the presidents need to sign, veto a piece of legislation, or do nothing. They have 10 days to do something, but they can't amend the content of the legislation in the formal process. Any such thing like a line item veto that Clinton tried to use, or the signing statement, are attempts to amend the content, which they don't have constitutionally the power. But that takes us to the next issue, because you mentioned this, but you mentioned it mostly in terms of the media's portrayal of the president, some scholars' portrayal or evaluation, or historians' evaluation of presidents. But it also, I think, it boils down to the public's perception of the president. Few people actually, in the population, and it's fine, read the Constitution necessarily. Few people notice that the second article, which deals with the presidency, it's tiny, minuscule, has 4 sections and a few, like 5 paragraphs in the whole thing, and that the president's powers listed there are very, very limited, a third of them being exercised only with the approval of the Senate. Because I think that a lot of what's happening, and I think you point out too, and the Congress's reluctance to intervene, even the court's reluctance to step on the toes of the executive, is in a way rooted in the public's perception and expectations from the president.
Yeah, I think that's right. Since the FDR era, we have grown in this country an infatuation with a strong presidency. So I've written other books on medium presidents and on presidential powers. The public has become very enamored with the idea of the one national leader, right, who will direct the affairs of the country and solve the country's problems. That is not our constitutional design. Our Constitution, as you point out correctly, put severe limits on the powers of the presidency. So we had a revolution against King George III. We didn't like executive power, and we didn't like concentrated centralized authority either. We began as a confederation, and then we had a constitutional convention to fix the problems with that, but we still wanted a principally decentralized system of authority with limited national power and a limited executive authority. That has fundamentally changed, and some of that by necessity in the modern era, of course. But with the growth of mass media and the infatuation that's driven also by scholarship with the so-called strong presidency, which for years was always assumed to be the progressive activist president, right? Has driven so much of the public's perception about what an effective president looks like. And so now you have, of course, both progressive liberal presidents as well as conservative ones, very infatuated with the unilateral powers of the presidency and pushing the limits of their power as far as they possibly can. Understandably, presidents want to have a legacy. They want to achieve as much as possible. And once they get into that office, it's not surprising that they see Congress as an impediment sometimes to getting all their great ideas enacted. So their perspective changes once they're in that office, and they like the exercise of unilateral authority because they believe what they're doing is right for the country. So that's where Congress needs to step in and set things right. But Congress has not done a good job in the modern era of protecting its institutional powers and prerogatives. And that's been
Yeah. Yeah, and especially I'm disappointed, honestly, in the Senate, because the Senate specifically has a lot of protections, and it was created as the cool-headed guys, right? They are there for 6 years. They used to be elected by the state legislatures to give them that distance and that protection to take decisions as trustees, right? To take decisions based on the actual common good and not on, you know, the whims of the mob, right? That can fluctuate from one day to the other. So I see the Senate sort of losing this sort of a stature. It still does a lot of things that the House doesn't do, but I'm sort of disappointed in them. And as you pointed out, the United States political system, as a comparativist, right, is specifically designed to be a representative democracy. I mean, it couldn't be more powerfully, exemplified by, you know, you look at the first article, the longest article in the Constitution that deals with Congress, all the lists of powers and checks, the fact that it has full power of the purse over the budget and all these things, which compared to Britain or compared to France, I always say the French president has much more power constitutionally than the US president, incomparably more power within the political system. The French president can dissolve the National Assembly and call for elections. I mean, radical things. But that's not how our system is built. And yet, we have had this almost inexorable, seemingly, push and drive towards creating a different system that functions differently than it was designed, a sort of intention with the Constitution. So my question is, do you think this is irrevocable? What's your sense in, like, what's the outcome here? Because of course we don't want to end in a constitutional crisis, but what can we expect?
Yeah, that's the hardest question you've posed to me this entire interview, of course. You know, where do we go from here and how do we fix what's happening? Maybe it's going to take a major crisis of some sort, because the way things are right now, people are enamored of executive authority. The public expects the president to be the one leader of the country and direct the nation's affairs. Well, again, we're both nonpartisan here, but I'm looking at the polling data regarding the current president. It's heading south pretty fast. And if this president doesn't respond to public opinion, at what point does the public realize that we've all created this, in a sense? We've all created this framework in our system where we want the president to be the one national leader, and Congress defers to the president. We're going to exact, electoral retribution on members of Congress of the president's party who don't stand with their president. I want members of Congress of the president's own party, especially, to challenge the president and hold him accountable for his actions. So I'm not sure how we break the logjam now. There are so many reasons we can't discuss in the period we have left about gerrymandered districts, lack of competitiveness in campaigns, the intensified polarization of our politics, which is frankly more at the governing elite level than it is at the public level. But when you have these gerrymandered districts, the general public isn't really getting the candidates that they necessarily would like in general election campaigns. A small number of people are picking nominees of parties in districts around the country, and it tends to be the most intensified, ideological people participating in the process. It's not good the way it's working right now. So I can imagine for another program someday, all the reforms we need, right? How we can change the finance system of election campaign, how we can make congressional campaigns more competitive with, nonpartisan committees that would draw districts rather than leaving it in the hands of partisan legislatures. I can list 5 or 6 things that I think would make a big difference. But it's going to take a lot of political courage by people in public office to stand up and want to do these things.
Yeah.
Willing to pay the
Exactly, and as you said, I mean, this political system, or the courts are not self-executing, but also the political system works in as much as we make it work. It's part of the whole, again, of the vision of the framers, that they assume that you would have civically minded people in politics who will make this work, because the Constitution is a piece of paper. It is alive in as much as we make it alive, in as much as we fight for it and drive it into fruition every day. And that takes the heroism of every generation. I think this is a very important point. And also, perhaps to end to reach the end of the conversation in a positive note, you also trust, and I do, also in the fact that in itself the alternation in power is in a way a self-check within the process. And I would say that the midterm elections will bring a change in the congressional distribution of powers, and that automatically will bring in a check.
Yeah, that's right. And we need to break the current system whereby right now there's a lot of anger on the political left, right? Probably the midterm elections will reflect that next year. So Mr. Trump's going to have a difficult second half of his term. And then who knows what happens in 2028. What I don't want to see happen is we lurch back and forth, different extremes, and, we're dealing with a backlash now. Then we're going to deal with a very different backlash 4 years from now.
Absolutely, yeah. So from one activist president to a more activist president, but in a different direction. And to conclude, the public perception plays a huge role, the media, and the entertainment media, I think, also plays a huge role in shaping our view of politics. And when I teach political science, I always try to find good movies about politics. And by the way, there aren't that many. There aren't that many that, for example, about Congress, there's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, there's Advice and Consent, but that stops at around the 60s. There hasn't been a good movie about Congress in 40, 50 years, but there has been movies about the presidents. There has been The West Wing, there has been Air Force One, Independence Day, and in each of them, the president is the hero. I think that also speaks to a lot of this. So here's my question to you. What are your favorite books or movies from the sort of entertainment part that talk about politics that you would recommend?
I'll go in a slightly different direction here, because being a political scientist, one of my mentors, Henry Abraham, when I was in graduate school at UVA, said, he was talking to graduate students, giving them advice about what the life of an academic is like. And he said, one of the things you'll regret is you're not going to read as much outside your field as you would like, because you're just so busy keeping up with the literature as it's evolving in your own discipline. And he was absolutely right about that. But, I am thoroughly enjoying this book right here. I highly recommend it. It's a book right now that just tells you about how random events, things that just happen in life, have such a profound effect on history, and things that we don't necessarily have control over. And it's just a wonderful disposition about that. And I've been reading this book as well, pages, which tells you about how different ideas take hold and why some just connect with the popular imagination, and why certain products just capture the public unexpectedly. What are the different formulas for that? All of this has relevance to the study of politics, actually, as well. And as far as entertainment media outside, I'm watching a wonderful series on Netflix right now called The Pit, and it's about a hospital, and it's the best medical drama I have ever seen. It's entirely realistic. It doesn't play the audience for being a fool. And it's just remarkably well acted. So I'm taking a little break late at night when I'm putting on a program from my usual deeply embedded studying and thinking about politics and public affairs. And that's how I keep.
Which takes us back to our sort of the thread that we followed in the first part of our conversation, which is the need to keep a holistic view of human existence, because human existence is much broader than politics, and yet all aspects of human existence play into politics. And I think this is exactly a living example of that, the examples you gave of books, not about politics, but it's actually about human existence, but inform our understanding of human behavior and thus of politics. books. Well, we will have to conclude here, which is a pity because there's so much to talk about, but I want to tell our viewers and listeners that there will be a link in the description of this video or audio file to all the books of Dr. Rozell, and especially the more recent ones on the presidency. And I can also tell you that they are not just interesting scholarly books, but they're fun to read. They are actually very well written. They're enjoyable to read. You're not going to fall asleep, okay? They're good books, and I wouldn't say it if it wouldn't be true. I am so happy that I got again to talk to you, that we are seeing each other again, and I'm grateful and honored that you participated in this podcast. Thank you so much, Dr. Rozell.
Jen, it's been a real pleasure and great to see you, and hope we can do this again in the future.
Yes, thank you so much.